Carson, Oskari-sama. I hope that you are well. I hope that you are well. Thank you all for coming today. I am very excited to get the opportunity to speak with you all. I will try to keep it slow and try to do it, but we'll see, get through this all. So today, we are going to be talking about a brief history of U.S.-Japanese relations, a very short history, and some of the differences and some of the similarities between the countries. So today, we are going to start by talking a little bit of the history prior to World War II. Then we are going to discuss the government structure of both countries and the ways in which they are the same and the ways in which the government is different. And we are going to discuss history after World War II. And finally, we will talk about the present situation, so maybe the last 10 years. But before we begin, let's talk a little bit about me, just a self-introduction. I think all of you know me. I teach all of you. But just in case, my name is Carson. I am from the United States. I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I studied political science and global studies with a focus on international relations in Asia. In 2019, I studied at Waseda University in Tokyo for 6 months, and that was my first in-person experience in Japan. Before that, I had only read about it online or in books. And I have been very interested in Japanese history and politics since I was about 10 years old, but it's something that maybe I wasn't really into until college, and then I was able to really develop and go into it. So let's begin with some history, everyone's favorite. So as you probably know, in the 17th century until the 19th century, the Japanese government stopped all foreigners from coming to Japan, outside of the city of Nagasaki, in which people from the Netherlands were able to trade. But what this meant was that Western powers, Western countries, so England, France, Germany, America, knew very little about Japan at that time. So they did not have very much knowledge about Japan, what Japan was like. It was a very mystical place to them at that time. And in fact, the rules for foreigners in Japan were so strict at that time that even sailors that were shipwrecked outside of, in Japanese waters, could not go home. They were usually kept in Japan. So there were very few people in the West that really knew about Japan, and very few people that could speak Japanese, and very few people that could trade with Japanese people. But that all changed in 1853, 1854. And this is when an American sailor, the American Navy, sailed into Tokyo Bay, Edo Bay, and essentially demanded that America begin trading with Japan. That Japan open itself up so that Americans could trade with them. Now, at this time, Japan did not want to open up, but because the Americans had a lot of good firepower, so they had very strong ships and very strong weapons, the Japanese government felt that they had to open up with America. So this led to the Convention of Kanagawa. And what this did was open it up so that Americans could trade and Americans could visit. And soon after this, of course, as you would expect, other countries like England and Germany also signed similar treaties that allowed them to trade with Japan, effectively opening Japan up. So over the next half century, Japan modernized and the world developed. And in the early 1900s, the US-Japanese relationship became more set. So at this time, the United States decided that they wanted the state of Hawaii, which all of you, I think, have heard of. But then, in 1920, about 43% of all people, so almost half of all people in Hawaii, were actually Japanese immigrants. But America was very afraid that Japan would take over Hawaii, and America wanted it to be a part of them, so they actually made it a state. And in modern times, the population of Hawaii, that is Japanese, is about 14%. Now, throughout this time period, lots of Japanese people also moved to America. They moved to America because they wanted to find better job opportunities, because they were forced to move, because they wanted to start a new family, for any number of reasons. But the problem was, there was a lot of racism in America at this time. Many of the Japanese immigrants moved to places like California, or Washington, or Oregon. But there were many people there, many white people there, that did not like Asian people. And so in 1913, actually the state of California made a law that made it very hard for Japanese people to own land. And before this, California had actually also banned all Chinese people from entering. So it was very difficult for immigrants, for Asian immigrants to America at this time. Now, during World War I, which was about 1915, Japan and America fought on the same side. And Japan actually fought the Germans as well. But at this time, Japan was trying to expand its control in China. And this made America and Western powers very unhappy. Now, several years prior, 20, 30 years prior, European powers had been doing the same thing in China that Japan was doing, but the European powers still did not like that very much. However, in 1917, the United States agreed to recognize that Japan had some control in China, but there was still a lot of racism in the US against Asian immigrants. So in 1924, actually, the American government decided that nobody Asian was able to come to America. They completely cut it off. And lots of people in Japan and Asia were very angry at this. Now, in the 1930s, early 1930s, part of the Japanese army invaded part of China and established a government there. Now, the United States did not like this. They said, well, we will not recognize that as a state. But very little was actually done. And in 1933, Japan decided to leave the League of Nations. Now, the League of Nations was a group, it was much like the United Nations, the Kokuren. So it was meant to help save people from fighting, but it did a very bad job of that. In 1937, Japan invaded China, but when they did that, America did very little. They just moved a fleet to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and actually, they sold Japan a lot of raw materials. So, in 1938, the United States actually sold Japan 56% of its war material for the war in China. So without America, it would have been very difficult for Japan to continue to fight. And this leads us to our next point, in which Japan decided to occupy part of Vietnam, or Indochina at the time, and the United States said, no, you can't do that. You need to leave. When Japan refused, America cut off the oil, because Japan bought most of its oil from America. Now, we all have recently witnessed this problem in real life with the current war in Ukraine there was a lot of trouble, even in Japan, getting oil because there was a lot of oil that came from Russia. So we understand that this is a real problem, and it was a problem then as well. So then this leads us to Pearl Harbor and the start of World War II. So Japan felt that they needed a lot more oil, and they knew that Indonesia and the Dutch East Indies had oil. But if they wanted to be able to secure that oil, if they wanted to be able to protect it, they needed to take the Philippines as well. And the Philippines were owned by America, so Japan felt that they had to go to war with America. And they did. They bombed Pearl Harbor, and then World War II happened. So now we're going to move on to what I think is the most interesting and what I am the most passionate about. And I hope you understand a little bit. I'll try to make it pretty simple. So we're going to talk about the government structure. So some of the similarities and the differences between the two countries in the way that the government is set up and how you can see some of the cultural factors in that. So after World War II, during the American occupation, Japan wrote a new constitution. And actually, it was first drafted by some American forces, but then it was changed by the Japanese officials and put into effect. It granted universal suffrage to the Japanese public. So what that means is that before this, not everyone could vote. And maybe we think it's very simple. Everyone should be able to vote. Everyone can vote, right? Not all of you, but very soon you will be able to. And it's very important that you do. But before this, only a very certain amount of people could vote, and especially no women could vote. And I'm seeing mostly women in this room. So essentially, a large portion of the population was being ignored. Actually, one interesting note is that the Japanese officials that changed it decided that they wanted to have a system in which there were two houses in the government. And I'll explain that a bit more later on. But it was something that the Americans said this is not necessary, and the Japanese officials said we want this. So some other interesting parts of the Constitution, and I'll talk about this very quickly, but right after the war, many people were afraid that the Americans would force the emperor to resign, to leave out, but they did not. Article 9 is very interesting, and we've talked about it in some of the classes, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more. But it means that Japan cannot have an army. So in America, or in England, or just about every other country in the world, once you turn 18, you can go join the army. But Japan does not have that. They have the self-defense forces, the JSDF, but it is much smaller and much less powerful than the militaries of many countries. And finally, Article 13 talks about human rights. So that is something that we talk about often in our classes, and it's something that maybe most of us take for granted. So the ability to go where we want, do what we want, more or less say what we want, talk to who we want. But in some countries, in some places, it's not common or not allowed. And so it was something that was put into the government. So let's talk about the organization of parliament, or the Diet, the Gikai in Japanese. So maybe you know this information, maybe you don't know this information, but the Japanese Diet consists of a House of Representatives and a House of Councilors. So it's two separate houses actually, which is the thing that the Japanese government officials